My tama had stories of having summer camps from just outside of Spokane, Washington, all the way up to Vernon, British Columbia. So imagine that, a little girl in 1904, 1908, 1910, traveling from Spokane, Washington, up into Vernon, British Columbia. And so that was who helped raise me for the first 6 years of my life. And I didn't realize until I was 30 years old just exactly how lucky I was to be raised by a grandmother who only spoke in Syilx, who only spoke our language, and who shared her teachings with me from her way of knowing, her way of seeing the world from our language. Our language is nonviolent. Indigenous languages are nonviolent. You cannot speak violently in our language. Another thing that my mom used to share with me is you cannot lie in our language. Our language is so descriptive that you cannot lie in the language. There are 100 different ways to say the word snow. 100 different ways to say the word snow. And there's a teaching and a reason about why we use that word to describe the snow and the way that it falls, and when it falls, and how it falls, and how big the flakes are. And so when we speak to each other, we also speak to each other from my view. And when I talk about somebody else, it's very descriptive on whether the person I'm talking about is older than me or younger than me, and how they're related to me, and whether I'm talking to them closely or from far away. Because in our language, when you hear our elders, even the way the words sound implies, you can hear the music in our language. And so when I'd learn about saying here, there, and way over there to help us remember, it was ihi, aha, and kahes. And so, our language is beautiful and descriptive, and English does no justice to our language. English has been a good language to help us all connect with each other and have a common language to understand each other, but it does no justice to the other languages out there. And so if you speak any other language, you know how hard it is to capture what you really know when you have to translate it into English. And so many of us have biases against people who don't speak proper English or have proper grammar, or where people are labeled illiterate, or they don't understand, or that they're not smart. But if we had the space for people to truly speak their languages, their first languages, we would begin to understand just how much we all know, and just how much knowledge and intelligence that we bring to the world. I'm talking about language because I went to this big language conference in Spokane, Washington a couple of months ago, and we were honoring language trailblazers and elders. And there's an elder in my nation who, I know he's been a relative of mine, and he's had a violent past, and he has done his work now as an elder, and he's also fighting to bring voice to violence in our own communities as an elder, knowing that what he's done and how he's contributed, and he's now made a commitment to questioning the actions of other men in our community who are abusive, not just abusive physically, but abusive in language and how they speak to others. And he's been following the work of Cultivating Safe Spaces. And so I have this elder who we went and hooked up with Starlink and got him an iPad And he's been online and he's been paying attention to Cultivating Safe Spaces work. And he was being honored in Spokane. And I went up after he had been honored and I sat beside him and he said, cultivating safe spaces is teaching our language in English. Cultivating safe spaces is teaching the way we govern in English, because we governed from a place of love. We governed from a place of trust. We governed from this deeper understanding that in order for us to be good decision makers and to be good people, we had to work from this place of love, trust, and faith. And so we're teaching people about us through cultivating safe spaces, because there's a couple of words that I'm going to be sharing with you throughout my little presentation here. And sometimes they can be really triggering for folks. One is I will share colonial or colonized, our colonial systems, our colonialism. And a lot of people there's so many different explanations for that word, right? And a lot of people don't understand what that means. And if you go on Wikipedia, it's like you're even more confused after you read through what is colonialism, what does it mean? And it gets really hard. And some people feel offended by it. Some people think that decolonizing means everybody going back to where they came from and going back to the old ways, and so I want to share in this space. I'm going to share the word colonial. And in the language of cultivating safe spaces, what colonial means is anything, any system, any rule, any process, any agenda that is built from a place of fear and control. Colonial systems are anything built from a place of fear and control. And I want to share this. It's the system. Colonialism is the system, not the people. And we have to, if we want to decolonize and change the way things are, we have to be hard on systems and soft on people. Colonialism and colonial systems have made us believe that we are no longer human beings, and we dehumanize ourselves and we dehumanize each other. And when we dehumanize ourselves in spaces, it's because colonial systems expect each and every one of us to show up as perfect performing machines here to do the work. Colonial systems have taught us that we are perfect performing machines here to do the work. And so to decolonize is to see our humanness again, to remember we are human beings. We're really hard on our generations today, like, oh, back in our day, we did this, this, and this. And, these young people are lazy and, how come they just can't, they're so soft. And one of the things I say is I'm so proud of our young people because they refuse to be treated as machines. So proud of our young people who have the courage to stand up and say, I am not a machine. I am a human being. I am a human being, and human beings need certain things. Human beings need belonging, connection, and safety. And when human beings have belonging, connection, and safety, they work from their most beautiful part of their mind, body, and spirit. They work from the most beautiful part of their mind, body, and spirit. I've never done a session like this before. I've never said these words in a session before. I always speak from the heart and I never prepare. I always speak from the heart and I never prepare. My English name is Elaine Alec. That was the name I was given to put on my birth certificate. But I was named Tithkanit before I was given my English name. My late father was Saul Kenzie Basil from the Bonaparte Indian Band from the Secwepemc Nation. And he was the son of Saul and Louisa Basil. And he was the grandson or great-grandson of Chief Basil David. And I started learning a little bit about my grandpa, Chief Basil David, because he was one of our hereditary chiefs from the Shuswap, the Secwepemc Nation. I know more about my mom's side because that's where I grew up, with the Okanagan Syilx Nation. But my grandpa, my great-grandpa, great-great-grandpa, when the reserves were established in the late 19th century, my great-grandpa was part of the delegation that traveled to Britain in 1906 and then to Ottawa in 1912 to present land grievances to the crown. And my great-grandfather was also part of the Wilfrid Laurier gathering that happened. And when I was reading about my great-great-grandpa, they shared that he was the most bitter. He was the most outspoken. And so I think about that because I always say it's my dad. My dad shows up with me in spaces. So my dad was a part of the American Indian movement and Red Power movement. And this year will be 50 years since my dad put up the first roadblock in Canada. And he put up the first roadblock in Canada 50 years ago because he asked for $200,000 from the federal government for clean water and proper housing for his elders and was denied. And so he put up a roadblock on the highway that goes through the Bonaparte Indian Band Reserve and charged a $5 toll to every vehicle that went through. My dad went to the Williams Lake Indian Residential School. And I wrote a book called Calling My Spirit Back. And in the book, I said he went to Kamloops. But my grandparent or my uncles told me that was not correct. My dad went to Williams Lake, but later when he joined the American Indian movement, he came to Kamloops, and he and a couple members of the movement shut down the residential school for the day, and they removed all the priests and nuns and stayed with the children until they were removed by the RCMP. And my dad was a warrior, and my dad had no fear. My dad was fearless. And growing up with him as a little kid, he was a quadriplegic because he got in an accident, a car accident. He was drinking and driving. My dad got in a car accident, became quadriplegic, but he lived for 15 years as a quadriplegic. And I would visit him, and the only thing we could do together was talk. And so I would just sit there as a little girl for hours, sometimes until 12 o'clock at night, listening to my dad tell stories about his experience with the American Indian movement and the Red Power movement. And he really put into me to never feel less than anybody else, especially not to government, to never feel less than government. They are not any more important than you. They are no more important than you. They are, they are not somebody or something to be afraid of or intimidated by. And so I heard that messaging my whole life, and it was put into me to really, truly believe that our laws and our knowing and our language supersede that of any human written law. That our language and our stories hold the laws to these lands. And those are the laws that will sustain human beings, not these written laws. These written laws have done more harm to human beings than anything. My dad was He was a warrior, and he had a warrior spirit. And when I'm afraid and uncertain and scared, I say the name of my dad, Kenzie Basil, to call his spirit into the room with me. Because I was taught that when you say the names of your ancestors who've passed on, it calls them into the room with you. And when you ask them for help to speak, that they will help give you the messaging you need for that time. And so whenever I speak, I have trust and faith that when I open my heart and I don't over prepare, that I'm opening up space for my ancestors to join me and speak through me. And I believe that they come here to help share these messages with people for healing, because my purpose is to gather and share the knowledge of our ancestors to promote healing for the mind, body, and spirit for all human beings. And so all of these beautiful things about my dad. My late mom was Sophie Alec from the Penticton Indian Band from the Syilx Nation and the Okanagan Nation. She was the daughter of the late Chief Jack Alec and Elaine Alec, who was also known as Philomene Francois, who was the daughter of Chief Francois, who is also known as Syilx, who was a son of Cuthbuck Jainton. And we are descended from Pelkamulach, who are hereditary chiefs on my mom's side. So I come from two hereditary lineages in so-called province of British Columbia, who have the largest land territories in the area. And with that comes responsibility. I was raised, if you claim rights over something, you better be prepared to carry the responsibility. You don't just get rights. You have to be responsible for those rights as well. You can't just take and expect. You have to build a reciprocal relationship with humans and all living things. And so, you know, there's a very different way when you think about rights and Indigenous knowledges and what we know and the responsibilities that come with that. It's never just you don't just expect things, you know, it's always a reciprocal relationship. And so our people, when we say Timhulach and land, one of the teachings that comes with that is understanding that Timhulach doesn't just mean land, it means all living things and living beings, all living things, including the universe, the stars, the water, the air, and the things that you can see and cannot see. And in that word, there's a sound that means that we have a concrete knowledge. We have a concrete knowledge that there are things that we can see and cannot see that are living beings. And a part of our language and land and responsibility is that exact thing. I have responsibility over every place that I know the language or story to. Because if I know the language for that mountain and I know the story of that mountain, that means I know the law for that mountain. I know the way to take care of that mountain. I know how to have a reciprocal relationship with that mountain and the things in that mountain to make sure that things regenerate so that things can be sustained. And I have responsible for all living things within that space that I know the language to. And so our elders said when I was growing up, they said, that means you don't get to pick and choose who you have responsibility over. So if you claim responsibility to this land, the Syilx Nation, Okanagan territory, these lands, you have responsibility for all living beings within this territory. All human beings. If you live within the territories that I know the language to, then I have a responsibility to teach you. Syilx people, Coyotes people were given the responsibility to teach. I do not feel that it is a burden to teach you because it was my responsibility given to me by knowing the stories and the families that I come from. How are you supposed to know how to live well within these territories if you don't know the language or the stories? How are you supposed to know you're not supposed to take from there that time of the year? How are you supposed to know there's a reason there's no fish in that lake? Don't go putting fish in that lake. There's a reason you don't build houses on that hill. There's a reason you don't live in that space. And now you see what happens when you don't know the stories. Landslides that wipe out all those houses on that hill that we said you don't build houses there. Floods that wipe out an entire community because you built houses in a place that we know the stories to. Indigenous knowledges, languages, and teaching these things to help cultivate safe spaces. So I'm going to share a diagram with you. And this diagram is the diagram I use for everything. It is a diagram that I use for my business planning, my policy, my agreements, my parenting. I use it to decolonize my parenting. I use it for everything. And I developed this framework because in 2019, I traveled across the province of British Columbia. And it was the most challenging thing I'd ever done in my entire career until that moment. Because back in 2019, I was asked to travel across the province of British Columbia to sit in circle with families and community members of missing and murdered. And I did not want to ask the questions, what can we do better? How do we do things differently? How do we improve? I knew that in order for us to have meaningful conversations about the violence in our communities, that we were going to have hard conversations. There is a colonial approach to trauma-informed, and there's a decolonial approach to trauma-informed. Colonial approach to trauma-informed is rooted in fear and control, and this belief that I, as the facilitator or counselor or person at the front of the room, has the power to take care of you, to heal you. If I trigger you, I'm responsible. It's my fault. I can be stripped of my certification if I hurt somebody else by triggering them. So there's a lot of fear. So you go into those spaces talking about hard conversations from a place of fear. So then you try to control the conversations. No good decisions are ever made from a place of fear. Decolonial approach to trauma-informed. Love, trust, faith, and a belief that I am not the one here to save you all. I am not here to fix you or heal you. It's not my job to do that. It's also not my job to create a safe space for you. I cannot guarantee a safe space for you. I cannot create a safe space for you. Safe spaces are not about silencing voices we don't like. Cultivating safe spaces is not about silencing voices we don't like. It takes away from the responsibility of us doing our work to be in spaces. And I'll share more about that in a little bit, but that work that we did, I did it in ceremony, and I used an Alkinwich, which comes from my people and our creation stories. It's a Syilx decision-making process. And our people teach it. Anybody can learn it. People go to the Okanagan Center in Penticton, British Columbia, and they have classes for third-year university students to take this course, to learn an Alkinwich. And we say, take this and take it into everything you do. Doesn't matter who you are. Kids from all parts of the world come to this training. Knowledge is no good if you don't share it. It's not for us to hoard. Our knowledges can help. And so we share it. But now we have conversations about, pan-indigenizing, and we have conversations about appropriating Indigenous knowledge. And so we get scared to share. And what are we allowed to share? And am I allowed to say that? And can I say this? And can I learn the language? And all of these things. And I challenge that all the time because my answer is yes. And I challenge those things all the time. And I say my answer is yes, because how I make decisions is based on our creation stories and the stories from my people that give us permission to remember who we are and share these things with each other, because that's what we're supposed to do. That's how we're supposed to evolve to be a human race that can be together in a space and contribute to the world in a way where we are healthy and the land is healthy. And we can't do that unless we share what we know with each other. And so people were too afraid to use an elk and wish in their processes. So I created a framework that everybody could see themselves in. And that framework is Cultivating Safe Spaces. And this framework is a decolonizing framework. It's a healing framework. It's a personal development framework. It's a professional development framework. When you uphold and when you start working towards upholding the framework of Cultivating Safe Spaces, you support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. When you use the Cultivating Safe Spaces framework, you're abiding to the recommendations in the In Plain Sight report. When you uphold the Cultivating Safe Spaces framework, you're addressing the recommendations in the National Inquiry's report, the calls to action, calls to justice. And so this is the framework that I want to share with you. And I'm scared to do full screen on this because I don't want to lose people. So I'm just going to share it from my browser. So this is an updated diagram of the framework. You may have seen an older version of the framework, but this is the newer version of it. In the middle of this diagram, you're going to see understanding self, love-based practice, patience, and discipline. Please feel free to take a picture of this and use it. We do share the PDFs afterwards, and there may be a way for you to access it through Moosehide. I can't remember, but you can reach out to us at support@cultivatingsafespaces.com if you want to get a copy of this. So the middle of this diagram are the 4 necessary conditions for cultivating safe space: understanding self, love-based practice, patience, and discipline. On the outside of the diagram, you're going to see the 4 circles, and you're going to see promote well-being, promote inclusion, promote freedom, and promote validation. Those are the 4 protocols for cultivating safe space. And so there's 4 pillars that have helped uphold colonialism. 4 pillars that have helped uphold colonialism. And those pillars are to promote sickness and death, exclusion, oppression, and control, and shame. So remember what I shared earlier, colonial systems are anything that's built from a place of fear and control. And these pillars and protocols uphold colonialism in every system, agenda, policy, process we have today and right now. And those are to promote sickness and death, exclusion, oppression, and shame. And so how do we begin to decolonize? We do the opposite. Instead of promoting sickness and death, we support well-being. Instead of promoting exclusion, we promote inclusion. Instead of promoting oppression and control, we promote freedom. Instead of promoting shame, we promote validation. So those are the 4 protocols for cultivating safe space. And then on the outside, or in the middle of the diagram, in the middle of the circles on the outside, you'll see traditional perspective, relationship perspective, innovation perspective, and action perspective. Those are the 4 perspectives for decision making. Each and every one of us has these perspectives inside of us, but one becomes dominant when you make a decision. And so traditional perspective are the storytellers. They are the knowledge keepers. They are the CEO or the executive of an organization that knows everything about it. They like to mentor the next generation and share their knowledge with them. They like to share their lived experience as a way to contribute to decision making. The relationship perspective need relationship. They care about connection. They want to make sure everybody's included and nobody's left behind. They do not care how long the process takes. The innovation perspective are the systems changers. And so it is no accident that our innovation perspectives are the most excluded from our spaces, because they are the systems changers. They are the visionaries. They are the ones that can see how to do things differently. And everything about them is seen as a deficit in colonial spaces. Innovation perspectives need time to think. They need time to process. Do not do brainstorming sessions with an innovative perspective. One question shoots off 10 more questions in their brain. They ask questions as a way to contribute to decision making, and their questions help contribute to meaningful change. And so often, if their questions don't align with our thinking and knowing, and we don't understand what they're saying, we write them off. We parking lot their ideas. They ask too many questions. We say, you're challenging my authority. They ask too many questions. We say, you don't know what you're talking about. You're way off base. You're going to throw us off. You're going to slow us down. Innovation perspective need time to think, need time to process. Even a survey for innovation people is tough. You might think you have a simple 5-question form for an innovation person and send it out to everybody. And an innovation person will sit there for a really long time because they have questions about your 5 questions. And it's not a simple response for them to fill out that survey. So different ways, how do you engage innovative perspectives? Action perspectives are very linear thinkers. They like to do things in the most effective and efficient way. They are the leaders. They are the leaders of the organization because they get things done. And what tends to happen in organizations, if you have a strong action team, you tend to exclude all of the other perspectives that can actually implement the work that needs to get done. But if you're trying to force your team members to work from a place of action, they're going to be confused. It's going to take a lot longer. They're going to get burned out. They're going to be exhausted. They're not going to understand. There's going to be confusion. And then we end up letting them go, or we, think that they're not doing their job. And so action perspectives are really great leaders. We need them. But we also need them to understand that those other perspectives need different things to be productive, to be effective, to be efficient. So I shared a little bit about in the beginning the importance of belonging, connection, and safety for human beings. Human beings need belonging, connection, and safety to function from the highest part of their brain. The highest part of their brain. And so they need, when people are feeling good, they're functioning from the green part of their brain, the executive state. They're creative, they are solutions-based, they come up with answers really easily, they work really quickly. When you're in your emotional state, that's when your brain is not, you cannot retain information in your emotional state, and you cannot be reasoned with when you're in your emotional state. And so no policy or process can make you move into your executive brain. The only thing that can help someone when they're in their emotional brain is the cultivation of connection and belonging. Because the only thing you're feeling in your emotional brain is, am I loved? Am I loved? Am I loved? Do I belong? So the only way to soothe that part of the brain is through the cultivation of connection and belonging. When you're in your trauma brain, you're working from 10% of your brain. You make mistakes, you drop the ball, you get cynical and negative. You have a hard time focusing. You cannot come up with an answer. When you're in your trauma brain, you cannot provide an answer. You can ask somebody a question in their trauma brain and they will not be able to give you an answer. And that will make it even worse because they'll think something's wrong with them because they'll think, I should know the answer. I should know the words to this. And then they begin to question, is there something even wrong with me? And the only way to soothe the trauma brain is through the cultivation of safety. And so when people are in their emotional and trauma brain, they're frazzled, they're negative, they're cynical, they're not motivated, they can't retain information, they cannot be reasoned with. And a lot of times when we see people behaving in these ways from their emotional brain and trauma brain, we call them a problem. Colonialism calls them a problem. They're a bad employee. They're a bad person. They're a bully. They can't get it together. When we can't show up and get out of bed and perform, we call ourselves bad. I'm a bad person. I'm a bad employee. Why am I so lazy? Only way to move out of that space is through the cultivation of belonging, connection, and safety. No rule, no policy can make somebody be a more effective employee. Understanding self. There's two questions that our people ask when we are in important decision-making spaces. Those two questions are Syilx squist and stimas puus. I want to share something as, you know, the sessions I did in 2019 to talk about missing and murdered. There was one thing I heard from all of our traditional people and all of our language people, all of our storytellers, all of our ceremony people. The common theme from these different nations across the province, different beliefs, different languages, different stories, different ceremonies, they had the same message. And that message was the answer to violence and trauma in our communities is coming of age. The answer to violence and trauma in our communities is coming of age. This framework supports coming of age. Understanding self. Syilx squist stimas puus. Syilx squist. If you were to meet one of our language speakers and they tried to speak English to you, you're coming into a meeting or a gathering, they're going to come up to you if they don't recognize you, and they're going to say in English, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" And you might think, "Oh, that's rude." You know, or, oh, you might get scared or wonder if you belong there. But if you knew what they were asking you in the language when they say Syilx squist, they're saying, who is your name? Who is your name? Not what, who? Who is your name? Who do you belong to? Who is your family? Who is your community? Who is your nation? What lands do you come from? What is your purpose? And how are you going to contribute to this space today? That question is an acknowledgement of the importance of identity. You need to know who you are and you need to know where you come from if you're going to make important decisions on behalf of yourself, your family, your community, your nation, and the land. You need to know who you are. Who are you? Who is your name? Where do you come from? Because when you have a strong sense of identity, you have a strong sense of connection and belonging and safety. And you work from the most beautiful, regulated, creative, efficient part of your mind, body, and spirit. That's how we want you showing up to make decisions. We don't want you showing up scared, like many of us do when we walk into a boardroom. I don't know enough. I'm not enough. I'm going to say something wrong. They'll think I don't know. I don't even know what I'm doing here. In our spaces, decolonized spaces, we want you to be your best. We want you to show up with what you know. In these spaces, you will never be expected to know any more than you know in this moment right now. You should see the relief on people's faces when I go into a meeting or a space and I say right away to the group of people, you are not going to be expected to know anything more than you know at this moment. And the relief in the body language from people when you share that with them, oh, I don't have to be perfect and prepared and know everything. I can be myself and share what I know. I can contribute from what I know, how I know, the way I know. When you know who you are, when you know where you come from, when you know your purpose, when you know how you contribute, you have this courage and you have this internal power that no one can ever take away from you. And when you have that kind of power, you never try to take power away from anybody else through violence of words or action. If you know who you are and you have that kind of internal power that you know who you are, you will never try to take power away from anybody else through violence of words or action. So when our elders and knowledge keepers said the answer to addressing violence and trauma in our communities is coming of age is about identity work. Who are you? It's a really hard question. People get triggered by that question. So many people don't know who they are or where they come from. We have a country full of people who identify as Canadian, and that's it. What is the identity of Canadian? How does that connect you to your own languages, your own families, your own lands, your own stories? Because each and every one of you comes from some place. And that place has stories and languages and culture that helps us feel that connection to something. So many people are drawn to Indigenous teachings because it's beautiful. You know, it feels good to be in these spaces. I love Indigenous teachings. Indigenous people can help save the planet. Why don't we just listen to Indigenous people? Indigenous people make up 3% of Canada. We make up 3% of Canada. A majority of the people who have come to Canada have come here as a result of war and violence. That's also hard. A lot of people don't even know where they come from, you know, because our parents, our grandparents didn't talk about it. Because a lot of people came from the war where there was violence and trauma. And we know how deeply intergenerational and multi-generational trauma impacts Indigenous people. It does not just impact Indigenous people. And so when we think about cultivating safe spaces, healing violence, how can we start changing things so that there's not so much violence in our communities and in the world? It always starts with healing self. That's the only thing we have control over. Colonialism makes us believe we can change other people, that we have the power to make other people behave and be a different way. In our stories, Coyote traveled across the lands to tame and transform the people eaters so that when humans came, we would be safe in these lands. And when I started doing this work in violence in our communities and systems change work, my teachers pulled me aside and they said, as you go out there and do this work, you remember Coyote. Coyote did not annihilate or destroy the people eaters. Coyote transformed them. Coyote transformed them. And we help to transform by telling stories, by hitting the emotion and helping people feel connected and belonging and safe so that their brain can open up and so that they can contribute to decision-making in their families in a good way. When you're in your trauma brain, you feel hopeless and helpless, and people who are hopeless and helpless are easier to control. And when people feel hopeless and helpless and they're in their trauma brain, it's easier for us to uphold the status quo and to be complicit to the way things are. That's what colonial systems want from us. That's why our policies, our rules, our laws, our process, our agendas are built from fear. Our school systems, our education, our governments, everything we have today is built from a place of fear. And so hard on systems, soft on people. How do we start to shift so that we can start support human beings to feel belonging, connected, and safe in these spaces so we have the courage and the capacity to be creative and effective and efficient and problem solving, where we're coming into spaces to do this work from a place of hope and love and trust and faith and not fear. The second question we ask is Stimas Bu'us, and that means what is on your heart? What is on your heart? That's an acknowledgement of the importance of feelings and emotions, that your feelings and your emotions, your grief, your trauma, those things, your joy, your happiness, those things impact the way you show up to make decisions. We have to acknowledge that as part of the business and part of the work. Colonial systems, you're expected to leave your emotions at the door before you sit at the decision-making table. We have a professional mask and a personal mask, and those two aren't supposed to be in the same space. Humanness in spaces, helping people feel a sense of safety, connection, and belonging when we come into spaces. So those are the two questions we ask people. Suitas quist and stimas bu'us. You need to answer these questions before we get to business. Love-based practice, I've already talked about that. Colonial systems are built from fear and control. And so if we want to decolonize to cultivate safe spaces, we have to work from a place of love, trust, and faith. When I do this work, as I'm developing this agenda, as I'm planning this meeting, as I'm reviewing this policy, am I doing this from a place of love and trust and faith? Am I doing this work from trust and faith? Or am I doing this work from fear and control? And when you start asking yourself that, every day you begin to realize just how many decisions you make from a place of fear and control. Because we have been taught, colonial systems have done a really good job at teaching us human beings that we don't know enough. We are not smart enough. We aren't prepared enough. We are not good enough. That is the core negative tape for most human beings. I'm not good enough. That's what colonialism has taught us. And so we don't trust ourselves. We don't trust ourselves in what we know. We don't trust our instincts and how we feel. I don't feel good about that, but I can't prove it. So it must not be valid. We've been taught to not trust ourselves. And so if I don't trust myself when I'm making decisions and I'm creating this agenda for this really important meeting that I'm going to, I'm going to do everything I can to control that agenda so that I have the answer, so that I don't look stupid, so that I don't look incompetent, so that I don't look like I know what I'm doing, because I'm so scared that's going to happen that I'm going to control my agenda, the timing, the people invited, the topics we're talking about, how long we're allowed to ask questions, Robert's Rules of Order, and how we show up and what we're allowed to say. And so when I do my work, when I start worrying about things like that, I have to really do the work at understanding self. That I'm here for a reason. I've been asked to do this work for a reason, and I have to trust myself in what I know. And that I will have the instinct to know how to navigate a problem if it comes up. I've been asked so many times, I do a lot of work between governments. I've worked with federal governments and provincial governments as an employee for both governments. And I've been a contractor for both governments for about 25 years now. And I've also worked in First Nations leadership organizations, political organizations, and I've been a liaison. I've been an elected representative for one of our political organizations. And I know how much fear comes to those tables. And I know how many times we develop an agenda to control the conversation because we're afraid. And when people come into meetings with controlled agendas like that, they know they're being controlled. And people, when they're controlled, they feel oppressed. And they do not feel safe. And they do not feel connected. And they do not feel like they belong. And so they move, everybody in that meeting moves to the emotional and trauma part of their brain, and they begin making decisions from a place of fear and control, and they uphold the status quo because they cannot tap into the regulated part of their brain to make good, effective, creative decisions. Patience is patience for self, because we have to be able to understand when we're being triggered, when we are in our emotional brain, when we are in our trauma brain, when I need to take a rest, because I can't force myself to go back to my executive brain when I'm feeling like that, when I don't feel safe, when I don't feel connected, when I don't feel belonging. I need to be able to do something for myself that cultivates connection, belonging, and safety. And I need to step away so I can show up as my best self, my best creative, effective, efficient self. So when I am not motivated, things don't make sense, I'm confused, I'm struggling with something, I'm negative, I can't see anything else, I'm hopeless. When I'm feeling like that, to not beat myself up and say, I'm a loser, I'm lazy, I'm all of these things. Why can't I pull it together? I need to practice patience and ask myself, how am I cultivating connection, belonging, and safety for myself? And then I need to be able to do things to take care of myself so that I can come back and work from my best self, because I become a problem. I become a problem when I show up in decision-making spaces from my trauma brain, from the part of my brain that is dysregulated. Listening with discipline. Discipline is a triggering word for people. It's so crazy because the way I understand the word discipline from my language and my upbringing, discipline means something very different than people who have a colonial understanding of discipline. Colonial understanding of discipline is fear and control, right? Shame is tied to that word for many people. But I encourage you to take a look at this word. How can you look at discipline from a place of love, trust, and faith? I'm going to listen with discipline to every voice in the room. I'm going to listen to every voice in the room without judging whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. I'm going to listen to every voice in this room with discipline without judging whether it's right or wrong, good or bad. I'm going to work really hard to sit there with discipline and listen to everybody. I've sat in a circle with 100 people at a national climate leadership event and listened with discipline to 100 people share who they were and what was on their heart. And so the thing that comes is colonialism has taught us to only listen to the voices we like and agree with, which upholds white supremacy. Colonialism has taught us to only listen to the voices we like and agree with, and that teaches us to uphold white supremacy. Because white supremacy is all about my way, the right way, the only way, the one way, the perfect way. And so we uphold that. We don't listen to voices we don't like or agree with. We've lost the ability to regulate ourselves when we hear things we don't like. And so we think creating, when people say we think creating safe spaces is about silencing those harmful voices we don't like or agree with. Because we're not regulated enough. We have not been disciplined enough to regulate ourselves to hear things we don't like. And when we hear things we don't like and we get triggered, and then all of a sudden we're in a dysregulated part of our brain where we're hopeless and helpless. Coming of age was about that discipline of understanding who you are and where you come from, because you are going to end up, you're born a human being. The reality of our teachings, you are born a human being. You're coming into this world as a human being. And as a human being, you will experience pain. You will experience suffering, and you will experience loss and trauma. You will. And colonial systems have set up a whole bunch of things for us to avoid feeling feelings, to not deal with feelings, to ignore feelings, to pretend feelings aren't a part of the thing, to let go of our humanness in spaces. And now we have all of these things that come up with that. Dysregulated people who don't know who they are, struggling to find some type of comfort or power. And then we lash out at people through violence. Violence in the way we talk to each other, violence in the way that we see each other, violence in the way we treat ourselves, and violence in the way we treat others. We think that we don't do that to ourselves, but we have dehumanized ourselves, and we cause violence to ourselves, which makes it easier for us to normalize violence in our societies. And so that discipline to listen to all of the voices was practiced from a very young age. It's never too late to start practicing listening with discipline. It's never too late. I dropped out of school in grade 9. But I learned to listen with discipline to everybody I met, no matter who they were, where they came from, what they believed. And I learned a lot. And I've been able to get to where I am today. And I tell kids this who struggle with school, who feel like they can't make it, need to drop out because they think they're stupid, because I was that kid. And I say, if there's one thing you can teach yourself to do to get through this, is to learn to start listening with discipline. And when you listen with discipline to voices you don't like, understand, or don't agree with, you're going to get triggered. Cultivating safe spaces isn't about silencing voices we don't like, because I'm going to leave the safety of my home. I'm going to go to a meeting. I'm going to go to a grocery store. And there's a very high chance, because I'm an Indigenous woman, that I'm going to experience violence. I'm going to go into a meeting and there's going to be racism and misogyny and patriarchy. And I can't change the people in the room, but I can cultivate a safe space for myself to stay regulated and to show up as my best self. On good days, I can do that, because I'm not a saint. There are days where I'm triggered and I can't regulate myself. And those are the days I practice understanding myself to know I'm not going to go. I know that space is not going to be good for me today, because I'm not in a good mindset and I don't think I can pull myself out of it. I'm not going to go. And that's discipline, because we think we have to be everywhere and everything. We're not allowed to say no. But I know myself. I'll be a problem. I will be a problem if I show up in that state. Listening with discipline ties into patience, love-based practice, and understanding yourself, knowing that you will be in spaces where you experience pain and trauma. You're going to hear things you don't like. Do you know yourself enough to be able to perform from the best part of your mind, body, and spirit? Listening with discipline, people know when they're being listened to, and people know when they're being dismissed. And what happens to people when they feel dismissed? They do not feel safe. They do not feel connected. They do not feel belonging. My elder, my lovely elder that I work with now and stay connected to, who talks to me about language and cultivating safe spaces, he was the elder everybody was scared of. Everybody was scared of him. He yelled and shouted and said things, scared people. But you should see what happens to him when you go visit him. You knock on his door, you sit down, and you just listen with discipline to him. The person he becomes when he knows he's being listened to, because human beings tie being listened to the words love and respect. When I feel listened to, I feel loved. I feel respected. And we have to practice that. I practice that with my husband. I practice that with my kids. Listening with discipline to them in the body language and how we treat each other. I have a 14-year-old daughter. Our relationship completely changed when I started seeing this craziness happening between us, the screaming matches, the throwing things, the I hate you, all of the dysregulated actions between a mom who's chronic disease and premenopausal and a girl who's coming into puberty. And things were going haywire. And I decided, let me try to utilize the Cultivating Safe Spaces framework in this relationship with my kid. And it worked. My relationship with my daughter is so much different because I take the time to listen with discipline to her. This training, we have so many different offerings now. Moose Hide Campaign was the first workshop I delivered for Cultivating Safe Spaces in person in February 2020. Moosehide campaign was my first in-person in Victoria that I ever did. Had no clue what I was doing. No idea what this was. And then next thing you know, it's just building and building and building. And a couple of months ago, I did a Cultivating Safe Spaces session for community leaders and government in Pakistan. Cultivating Safe Spaces is turning global. We are moving a lot of our trainings online, and we're moving into the educational technology sector. And we're starting to build a suite of offerings for cultivating safe spaces and train the trainer. And we are developing a 2-day in-person cultivating safe spaces for executive leadership who want to learn how to apply the Cultivating Safe Spaces framework into their organizations to support their employees, because it's so funny how it works. Executives, oh, we have problem employees, we're having bullying and issues, and we're going to send them to this workshop. And they send them to the workshop, and the employees come to our workshop, and then they realize, oh, we're not the problem. We're not the problem, the system's the problem. Then they go back to their bosses and say, so we learned that cultivating safe spaces is an accountability framework, and we want to know what you're doing to support systems change with this framework. And then the executive teams are like, oh, we didn't think about that. So we're developing a training to support executive leadership with that, because the framework is we're being asked to do this in organizations across Canada, big, large provincial and federal organizations, national organizations, and international, in different spaces. We're working in education, we're working in HR, we're working in health, we're working in governance, language revitalization. This framework applies to everything. We have 105 certified Cultivating Safe Spaces facilitators across Canada. So if you go to our website, we have some of them listed. If you're looking for a CSS facilitator in your area, in your province, in your region, we have them. So Elon, if you can share the Cultivating Safe Spaces link in the chat, and then our Naqsmist website address as well, for people. So we have a lot of different things that we're doing with Cultivating Safe Spaces to help support humanizing of people in all spaces, in all sectors, in all languages. This workshop, I do keynotes for them and presentations like this, and I do 3-hour training sessions and 5-hour training sessions, and none of them are ever the same. This is totally, this one went completely different. It's always that way with Moosehide. For those of you who signed in a little bit later, Moosehide is a priority for me every year. I support this work. For those of you who might not know, Raven Lacerte is my adopted daughter. I adopted her in ceremony in 2020. And we align our work in so many different ways, and any way that I can support her magic in the world, I will continue to do. And her vision of having 1 million people fasting to end violence against women and children, because fasting and ceremony changes lives. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you who have been here and who support the Moosehide campaign, and who came here to join us today. I know Elon, I'm so bad at this. Elon needs to share the survey with you all to give feedback. I do read the feedback when people send it, and makes me cry and gives me the energy to, keep doing what I'm doing. And so Elon, I'll share that information with you.
Thanks so much, Elaine, and thank you all for coming. It's been such a beautiful workshop, and it's so nice to see so many people show up for it.